Hi, this is Anthony. I want to make this video to explain exactly what the Mars 360 system is. The Mars 360 system is calculating your astrological birth chart and taking the information regarding where the position of Mars was located at the time you were born and placing that information on either your birth certificate, driver's license, state-issued ID, or any other form of outward insignia. The premise behind this idea is to alert others in a human community as to how to deal with you. In Aries Lemon, Mars is said to enact influence on human beings through reducing the amount of gray matter in the area of the brain associated with its natal astrological position. So there are 6 major lobes of the brain: the frontal lobes, the temporal lobes, the occipital lobe, the parietal lobe, the brainstem, and the cerebellum. So in astrology, the astrological chart is divided into 12 30-degree sectors. In Aries Lemon, I take that chart as it's divided into the 12 30-degree sectors and essentially change it into being interpreted as only 6 30-degree sectors. One sign and its correlating opposite sign is read as altogether one sign. So if you take a chart that has 12 30-degree sectors and read it in that manner, it becomes interpreted as just 6, altogether 6 sectors. So in Aries Lemon, the 6 lobes of the brain are correlated with the 6 seals in the book of Revelation. The first seal would be at the midheaven and is assigned to the occipital lobe of the brain and is responsible for how we develop our face-to-face communication within our immediate environment and how we feel about other people's property. If we move counterclockwise to the next 30-degree sector, we get to the second seal, which has been assigned to the temporal lobes of the brain, which is responsible for our auditory processing, our hearing, our listening, and our thoughts. If we move counterclockwise to the next 30-degree sector, we get to the third seal, which has been assigned to the brainstem cerebellum portion of the brain, which is responsible for our breathing, our diet, our movement, and our basic survival skills. Now if we move counterclockwise to the next 30-degree sector, that portion is assigned to the frontal lobes of the brain, and this section is responsible for our executive control functions, our ability to make decisions, engage in discipline, choose our words carefully, learn, our working memory, and our attitude, our indirect communication and attitude to cultures that are not our own. So if we move counterclockwise to the next 30-degree sector, we get to the fifth seal, and that has been assigned to the parietal lobes. That portion has been assigned to the motor cortex portion of the brain, which is near the top part of our skulls and is responsible for our ability to plan in advance movements. This portion of the brain is responsible for our work ethic, how we deal with authority figures, and how we and our our overall view of our overall view of economics in general. If we go counterclockwise to the next 30-degree sector, this is the last seal, and this is the last seal, and has been assigned to the parietal lobe of the brain, which is responsible for how we interpret sensory input from our environment, how we display ourselves in view of others, and how we interpret input from others within our environment. Now, the premise is that Mars has an influence on the portion of the brain based on where Mars was positioned at the time you were born. So, for example, if you were born when Mars was rising in the east, then Mars would be affecting the frontal lobes of your brain, and therefore causing you to display deficiencies in the designated characteristics that are assigned to the frontal lobe functions. Because the planet Mars causes a reduction in gray matter to certain portions of the brain based on where it was positioned at the time you were born, we as human beings can now, in understanding that, provide a certain amount of leeway to other humans as they engage or as they navigate through life in whatever way they see fit in terms of how they express themselves within a given society or within a given community. This element of understanding that comes into play is something that can be a great potential for peace, understanding, and justice here on Earth. The idea of every human placing the location of Mars in their astrological birth chart on a birth certificate, on a driver's license or state issued ID, or on some outward form of insignia where people in society can see how that person is influenced by Mars, we can thus provide ourselves an impetus to a more utopian society, to a more peaceful, more harmonious way of life. Something that's missing in contemporary times, and something that has been missing going back to antiquity. The idea is that nations can apply the location of Mars, wherever it was at the time a person was born, to the state ID, the state issued ID, the driver's license, or the birth certificate, as a measure of understanding, or as a measure of keeping a certain amount of, as a measure of maintaining a certain amount of equilibrium and understanding within their society. So this Mars 360 system provides an opportunity for people who live in two different nations to maintain a certain amount of connection based on their Mars position. This can be done without any threat to national sovereignty or geographical borders. The main component that should arise from this Mars 360 system is the element of understanding. Whereas humans knowing how other humans are affected by the planet Mars, and vice versa, other humans knowing how the individual is affected by Mars, can allow for humans to forgive or accommodate qualities that would normally be deemed unacceptable. It's not just having a Mars indicator on a birth certificate, driver's license, or state-issued ID, or having some form of outward insignia that shows where Mars was positioned at the time you were born. It's also allowing society to divide itself or to sector itself based on each person's Mars position, meaning all the people in a society all the people in a given society who are affected by Mars in a certain way would at the same time be accommodated by that society, in which the society would create an atmosphere specifically for that group to express itself according to how Mars influences human beings. So, for example, if Mars influences a certain sector of human beings within the society to be a little bit relaxed when it comes to face-to-face communication, the society would create environments where those particular humans can sort of act freely or display that tendency to have a certain amount or a certain lack of care regarding face-to-face communication. So you can have society could create situations where this quality would not be looked down upon by anyone else, because the environment would be understanding of that particular situation. And this would apply not just to Mars, that particular Mars influence, it would apply to every type of Mars influence. So the outcome would be, at the very least, a society with divided into 6 sectors, where each of the 6 Mars influences can be allowed to express themselves as Mars influences them to express themselves in a certain way, to express themselves freely or feel that they don't have to try and overcome this Mars influence. This is essentially the gist of the Mars 360 system. You're in a nutshell allowing humans to be themselves, and you're sort of forcing society to accommodate each human to be themselves according to how Mars influences them at birth. The outcome that should arise from the Mars 360 system is a certain amount of balance, harmony, and cohesion between government and people. Now, ideally, when it comes to the Israel-Gaza Palestinian factor, Israel would be wise to set up some sort of observatory that would indicate where Mars is positioned in the sky, just to encourage understanding when it comes to the Mars influence. So, as spoken before, when Mars enters within 30 degrees of the lunar node, there is an escalation in Israel where a higher than normal amount of rockets relative to the rest of the year are fired from Gaza into Israel. In response to this, Israel should create an observatory so that the people can see for themselves that when Mars goes within 30 degrees of the lunar node, it's invoking an influence that precipitates a certain level of violence and a certain level of strife, a certain level of war. It should also be something that encourages people to understand that in order to remain safe in society, Mars has to be continuously observed, it has to be watched, and it has to be noticed. Based on the statistics that I give in Aries Lamanda, not paying attention to the Mars influence will just continue to infect the human race with wars, with conflict, without any of us really understanding why such problems continue to happen. So this is why I recommend that Israel would create some sort of observatory to the planet Mars to encourage the public to pay attention to its influence, and also alert the public when Mars goes within that 30 degrees of the lunar node.